In our game today, Hikaru Nakamura unleashes hell on the f7 square. In fact, this game is a perfect example of a sacrificial attack, just sacrificing piece after piece after piece, throwing everything in the kitchen sink at his opponent's king. His opponent is Grandmaster Ilia Smirin. This was played in Foxwoods in 2005. Nakamura has the white pieces, Ilia Smirin has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. Nakamura begins with e4. And g6 is played by Smirin. He's playing the modern system. d4, bishop to g7, and knight to c3, putting this knight in the most aggressive post possible. d6 and f4, creating the formation known as the Austrian attack, taking as much of the center as possible. And basically, white just wants to attack with e5 and go right at black in the center. Knight f6, knight f3, castles, and without delay, Hikaru plays e5. He wants to dislodge this important defensive knight at f6, move it away from his opponent's king so he can go right after it. Knight f to d7, and here he plays another very aggressive move, h4. This is a move that was pioneered by the great Grandmaster David Bronstein, and his idea basically is to pry open the h-file, h4, h5. You leave this rook sitting on the h1 square, and you get this incredible attack. Now, Smirin, a very strong player, plays over 2,600, plays c5. We know that the best way to deal with an attack on the wing is a counterattack in the center of the board. So he plays a very strong move, the accurate c5, immediately putting pressure on the d4 pawn. But Hikaru doesn't care. He just continues on with h5 and allows cd4. Now, when David Bronstein originally played this in, I think, 1958, Queen d4 was his move, and the idea was he wanted to play the queen to f2 and then to h4 so that the queen and rook would align on the h-file in preparation to attack. But Hikaru goes ahead and just takes with the h-pawn, not worrying too much about the knight on c3, which Smirin immediately grabs, so now he is up an entire piece. Now, Hikaru begins to put enormous pressure on the f7 square. Usually when we talk about great attacks against the f7 square, it's usually when the king is not castled yet. But here, Ilia Smirin is already castled, yet there's still a vicious attack on this f7 square. gf7, rook f7, and now bishop to c4, obviously pinning that rook and aiming at the king. Now, black does have a good move here. It's very hard to see. It was not played, and that's the move e6. The reason that's a good move is because it's a mistake for white to take that with the bishop. White actually loses with that move because black has this nasty reply, knight takes e5, threatening knight f3 check, unleashing this bishop against the bishop on e6, and if bishop takes rook, then the knight can recapture the bishop, and black is completely winning. The better move after e6 for white is, knight to g5. And here this is, computers say it's equal, but it's still a very wild and sharp position. But instead of e6, black plays the move knight to f8, putting that knight in a very strong defensive position. You know the old saying that when you put a knight at f8, you'll never get checkmated? Well, this may be an example where that's not quite the case. Hikaru plays knight to g5, continuing to pile on to this weakened f7 square, the pinned rook at f7. And now e6 makes sense. The bishop defends that, so you're blocking the bishop at c4. So he goes ahead and takes the rook with the knight. Now here, Smirin plays a novelty. He plays the move cb2, but it's not a great novelty. The main move here is king to f7, but white still gets a very strong attack. Queen to h5 check, king g8, and the bishop moves back to d3 to aim at h7. This is a thematic idea, that bishop shifting back to d3 to attack h7. Now, if black plays the natural move knight b to d7, he's actually lost because bishop h7 check, knight takes, queen takes, king f8, and here queen to h8 check is the end of the game because after bishop takes queen, rook takes queen, after the king moves, pawn takes, and that removes the king as a defender of the queen. After king takes pawn, rook takes queen, and he is winning. Instead of knight b to d7, actually h6 is the best move, but rook to h4, threatening rook to g4, which I believe has only been played once, is a very strong reply for white, and black, I think, is still in some trouble. But Smirin played the move cb2. The problem, of course, is after bishop to b2, it activates this dark squared bishop, and when these pawns exchange in the middle, then he's got this open diagonal aiming at the bishop on g7. Queen to a5 check was played. Now, if king takes knight, then queen to h5 check, king g8, and white just castles long. And all of these pieces comfortably enter into the attack, and black is in huge trouble. So because of that, Ilia Smirin first plays queen to a5 check. He wants to unsettle white so that he can't just conveniently play the queen to h5 and then just castle long. So the king moves to f1. Now he takes the knight. Queen to h5 check. Now the king is forced back to g8. The reason is if he goes to e7, then e d6 check, and now this bishop is going to win the g7 bishop because the king is in check. And if he plays knight to g6, then f5, and he's pinned all over the board. The bishop pins the e-pawn, the queen pins the knight, and that is it. So he has to go back to g8. Then bishop shifts back to d3. We saw this shift in the other variation earlier. Now queen to b4. What Ilia Smirin is doing, he's attacking the f4 pawn and also the bishop on b2, but Nakamura deals with that very effectively. He plays the move rook to b1, defending the bishop and setting up a potential threat, and he's not concerned about queen to f4 check. He's fine with that, because in that case, the king can move to e2, and there are really no comfortable checks for black. There's no place the queen can check black without being captured. And if, say, h6 to set up an exchange of queens on g5, then rook to f1, and after queen g5, you just play queen to f7 check, king h8, and then bishop to c1. And every single piece is obviously active in the attack, and black is totally finished here. So instead, he plays the move bishop to d7. But now Nakamura plays a really strong reply, c4, and the idea is he's allowing the bishop at d3 to defend the b1 rook, so that the bishop at b2 can now move and discover an attack against the queen, because the rook at b1 is defended. So he plays queen to d2, threatening the d3 bishop, but then bishop h7 check, knight h7, queen h7 check. The king moves to f8, and now the maneuver we saw in a previous variation, rook to h4, and the threat of rook to g4 basically is devastating. He threatens the bishop on g7, which basically has nowhere to go. And if it does move, rook to g8 checkmate would be played. So in this position, Ilia Smirin resigned, and Hikaru shows us a brilliant attack on the f7 square. Now, even after going over this great game from Hikaru Nakamura, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to watch is in this video right here, so be sure to check that out next for some really mind-blowing chess. Goodbye.